The humidity in Marengo County doesn't just hang in the air, it possesses it. It is a thick, gelatinous presence that tastes of iron and rot. A physical weight that slows the heart and muddies the mind. For Julian Vance, a man who had spent the last decade breathing the filtered, recycled air of a Chicago high-rise, the air of his ancestral home felt like a wet shroud. Julian stood on the porch of the Vance estate, a sprawling antebellum ruin that looked less like a house and more like a bleached carcass being swallowed by the Alabama jungle. The kudzu, that mile-a-minute vine, was the true owner here. It draped over the chimneys like green velvet muscles, suffocating the oaks and strangling the fence lines. He held a rusted iron key in his hand, the last thing his father had given him before the dementia took his tongue. His father's final words hadn't been, "I love you," or "take care." They had been a frantic wet wheeze. "Don't let the red dirt inside. Once it's under the floorboards, Julian, the house starts to eat." Julian sighed, the sound lost in the deafening thrum of the cicadas. It was 4 o'clock p.m., and the sun was a bruised orange orb sinking into the pines. He turned the key. The lock didn't click, it groaned, a sound of metal complaining against years of grit and salt. The interior of the house smelled of ancient things, cedar, damp paper, and a sharp, metallic tang that Julian couldn't place. He flicked his heavy-duty flashlight across the foyer. The beam cut through dust motes as thick as snow. He had come here to settle the estate, to sell the land to a timber company, and to bury the Vance name once and for all. But as he stepped onto the warped hardwood, the floorboards didn't just creak, they sighed, a long, hollow inhalation that seemed to come from the very foundation of the earth. By 9 o'clock p.m., the Alabama night had settled in with a predatory stillness. Julian had cleared a small space in what used to be the library. He sat on a camping stool, a bottle of bourbon at his feet, reading through the stack of yellow journals he'd found in his grandfather's desk. The entries were frantic. They didn't talk about crops or weather. They talked about the pulse. June 14th, 1954. One entry read, "The rains came, but the water was red. Not the color of the clay, but darker. The cattle won't cross the creek anymore. They stand at the edge and scream until their throats go raw." Silas says he saw a man walking in the high grass near the old quarry. Said the man didn't have joints, just moved like a willow branch in the wind. "We don't go out after the lightning starts anymore." Julian took a long pull at the bourbon. "Superstition," he whispered to the empty room. "Old world ghost stories to keep the kids from wandering into the swamps." But then he heard it. Scratch, scratch, scratch.it was coming from the wall behind him. It wasn't the frantic scurrying of a rat or the dry rustle of a wasp's nest. It was slow, methodical. It sounded like a fingernail, a very long, very hard fingernail dragging against the back of the wallpaper. Julian froze. The sound moved upward. It traveled from the baseboard to the ceiling, then across the rafters. He followed it with his flashlight. The beam landed on a patch of the ceiling where the plaster had bubbled and cracked. A drop of liquid fell. It landed on Julian's hand. It wasn't water. It was a thick, viscous mud, deep crimson in color. It was warm. He wiped it away, but the stain remained on his skin, a faint pink smudge that smelled of copper and wet earth. He looked back up. The crack in the ceiling was widening, and from the darkness of the attic space, a single pale eye peered down. It had no lid. It was just a wet, milky orb embedded in a mass of tangled, root-like fibers. Julian didn't scream. His throat had locked tight. He backed away, his boots thumping on the hollow floor, until he hit the front door. He fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The wood had swollen in the heat, or something was holding it shut from the other side. He turned back to the room. The scratching was everywhere now. It was in the floor, the walls, the furniture. "Who's there?" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. The response was a low, vibrating hum that shook the glass in the windows. Outside, the cicadas suddenly went silent. The silence was worse than the noise. It was a vacuum that pulled the air out of his lungs. Through the tall, narrow windows of the library, Julian saw a light, a pale, flickering blue glow emerging from the woods. It moved with a strange, jerky cadence. As it got closer, he realized it wasn't a lantern. It was a person or the shape of one. The figure stopped at the edge of the porch. In the moonlight, Julian saw the man his grandfather had described. He was tall, unnervingly thin, and his skin had the texture of dried, cracked mud. He wore rags that had been stained into the color of the earth. Where his face should have been, there was only a jagged hole, and from that hole, a thick red root protruded, swaying like an elephant's trunk. Sniffing the air, the creature raised a hand and pressed it against the window pane. The glass didn't shatter. It began to soften, melting like wax under the heat of the creature's touch. "Julian," a voice sighed. It didn't come from the creature. It came from the walls of the house. It was his father's voice, but it sounded like it was being filtered through a mouthful of dirt. "Julian, the soil is so thirsty. It's been so long since Vance came home to bleed." The floorboards beneath Julian's feet began to buckle. Thick, ropey vines read as arterial blood burst through the wood. They didn't move like plants. They moved like snakes, lashing out to coil around his ankles. He kicked out, his heavy work boots crushing the soft, pulpy fibers. But for every one he broke, 3 more emerged. They were wet and hot, smelling of ancient, underground rot. He scrambled onto the library table, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The creature at the window was gone, but the glass was now a gaping, warped hole. The heavy, sweet scent of gardenias flooded the room, so strong it was nauseating. Julian grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. "Get back!" he screamed. At the shadows, the red roots began to weave together in the center of the room, rising up like a macabre sculpture. They formed a shape of torso, arms, a head. It was a mockery of a human form, a puppet made of subterranean growth. The root man turned its featureless head toward Julian. Then, the floor gave way entirely. Julian fell. He didn't hit a basement floor. He fell into a wet, pulsing darkness. He landed on something soft and yielding a carpet of moss that felt like velvet-covered flesh. He flicked on his flashlight. The beam revealed a nightmare. He was in a cabin beneath the house, but the walls weren't stone. They were made of millions of interwoven roots, all of them twitching in a slow, rhythmic unison, and embedded in the walls were things pale, shriveled husks that might have once been people. They were being kept alive, their veins connected to the red roots, their bodies serving as living batteries for the forest above. Dot, in the center of the chamber, stood a massive, heart-shaped bowl, 6 feet wide, pulsing with a dull, bioluminescent glow. Thump, 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 the singing river, the red clay hunger. It wasn't a legend. It was a biological entity, a subterranean parasite that had claimed the Vance family generations ago. "You early, Julian?" the voice whispered, echoing through the chamber. Julian turned his light toward the source. There, half submerged in the root wall, was his grandfather. He had been missing for 30 years. He looked exactly as he had in the old photographs, except his skin was translucent, and his eyes were the same milky, lidless orbs Julian had seen in the ceiling. "The harvest is beginning," his grandfather said, a terrifying smile stretching across his face. "And Alabama is such a hungry state." Julian didn't have time to process the sight of his grandfather's living corpse. The air in the root cavern was thinning, replaced by a heavy, cloying pheromone that made his head swim. He scrambled backward, his hands sinking into the spongy, mossy floor. The moss felt like 1,000 tiny mouths, each one trying to latch onto his skin. Why, Julian choked out, the iron fire poker still gripped in his white-knuckled hand. His grandfather's head lolled to the side, his neck creaking like a dry branch. Because the land remembers, Julian. Before the cotton, before the steel mills, before the first man set foot in the delta, the root was here. It doesn't care about names or borders. It cares about the blood that binds. A Vance started the pact. A Vance must sustain it. A thick, red tendril the size of a human arm slid from the ceiling and coiled around Julian's waist. It didn't squeeze immediately. It pulsed, as if it were tasting him through his clothes. Julian didn't hesitate. He swung the fire poker with every ounce of terror-fueled strength he had left. The sharp iron edge bit into the root, and instead of sap, a spray of hot, iron-scented liquid erupted. The root shrieked a high-pitched, ultrasonic frequency that vibrated Julian's teeth. The coil loosened, and he tumbled back into the darkness. He ran. He didn't know which way was out, but he followed the slope of the ground, hoping it would lead back toward the cellar stairs. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating more husks in the walls. These weren't just fancies. He saw faces he recognized from Old Town ledgers, missing drifters, runaway farmhands, even a sheriff from the 1920s whose disappearance had never been solved. They were all part of the red clay now, their bodies being slowly digested over decades. He found a set of stone steps, slick with slime, leading upward. He hauled himself up, the fire poker clanging against the rock. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the roots shifting, wet, slithering noise like a million snakes moving through mud. He burst through a wooden trapdoor and found himself in the cellar of the main house. But he wasn't alone. Standing in the center of the dark basement, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the high, narrow vents, were 3 figures. They weren't creatures of the clay. They were men. One of them was Miller, the local hardware store owner who had sold Julian his supplies that morning. Beside him stood the local preacher and a man Julian didn't recognize. They weren't holding weapons. They were holding bowls made of dark, unglazed ceramic. You shouldn't have gone down there so soon, Julian, Miller said. His voice was calm, almost disappointed. The root likes to let you settle in first. It likes the blood to be calm. You knew? Julian gasped, backing toward the coal chute. Knew? The preacher laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Boy, this town exists because of that root. You think the crops grow this tall in this heat by accident? You think we've survived every drought and every storm by luck? We are the stewards of the red. We keep the world out, and the root keeps us fed. It's a balance. You're monsters. Julian spat. No. Miller stepped forward, the blue moonlight catching the silver in his hair. We're survivors. Your family made the deal a century ago. They were the architects. We just make sure the contract is honored. Now, you can go back down willingly, and it'll be peaceful. A long, slow dream. Or, we can do this the hard way. The preacher raised his bowl. Inside, a pool of that same crimson liquid shimmered. He dipped his fingers in and began to draw a symbol on his own forehead, the shape of a 3-pronged root. Julian didn't wait for the hard way. He grabbed a heavy jar of pickled preserves from a shelf and hurled it at Miller's head. As the glass shattered, Julian dived for the coal chute, a narrow metal tunnel that led to the backyard. He scrambled up the rusted incline, the metal scraping his skin, while the men shouted behind him. He burst out into the night air, the humidity hitting him like a physical blow. He didn't look back. He ran toward his car, the keys already in his hand. but the car was gone. In its place was a massive mound of kudzu, the vines already thick and woody, having grown over the vehicle in less than 4 hours. The tires were popped, the engine block cracked by the sheer force of the roots. "It knows you're trying to leave," a voice whispered. Julian spun around. It was the man-thing from the porch, the one with the root in its face. It was standing just 10 feet away, its pale, mud-cracked body swaying. It wasn't attacking, it was waiting. Julian realized then that the woods weren't just trees anymore. The entire forest was a single, interconnected nervous system. Every step he took on the red clay was a signal to the hive root. He looked toward the main road, but the trees had moved. The path he had driven in on was gone, replaced by a wall of impenetrable thorns and interlocking branches. The landscape was shifting in real time, rewriting the geography of the county to keep him trapped. He had one hope: the river. The Black Warrior River was only a mile through the dense brush. If he could reach the water, maybe the root couldn't. "Follow." He plunged into the woods, the fire poker held like a machete. The forest fought him. Branches whipped at his eyes, roots stripped his feet. The very ground felt like it was tilting to send him sliding back toward the house. As he hacked through a thicket of briars, he saw a light in the distance. Not the blue glow of the root, but the harsh, yellow glare of a flashlight. "Over here," a voice cried. Julian hesitated. Was it another townsman? Or someone else? A young woman emerged from the brush. She was covered in dirt, her clothes torn, and she carried a double-barreled shotgun. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and recognition. "You're Vance, aren't you?" she hissed. "I can smell the clay on you." "Who are you?" Julian asked, his chest heaving. "My name is Sarah. My brother was taken last month. I've been living in the hollows, trying to find a way to burn it." To burn it all? She looked toward the house, where the blue glow was now a towering pillar of light. "The root is waking up for the centennial bloom. If we don't kill the heart tonight, there won't be an Alabama left to save. It'll spread to the Gulf. It'll spread to the world." Julian looked at his stained hand, the pink smudge that wouldn't wash off. He felt a throb in his veins, a rhythmic pulse that matched the heartbeat of the cavern below. "How do we kill it?" Julian asked. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a gallon of industrial-grade herbicide mixed with gasoline. "We don't just burn it, Julian. We have to poison the blood. And since you're a Vance, you're the only one who can get close enough to the heart to deliver the dose." Julian looked back at the house, where the man-thing was now joined by dozens of others, the silent stewards of the town, all converging on his position. "Tell me what to do," Julian said. Sarah didn't waste time with explanations. She grabbed Julian by the arm and pulled him into the hollow of a lightning-scarred oak. Outside, the woods were screaming, not with voices, but with the sound of wood splitting and earth churning. The centennial bloom was no metaphor. The very ground was beginning to heave as the root prepared to send its spores into the atmosphere. "The heart is directly beneath the Vance Library," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the cicadas. "But you saw those men." "They aren't just cultists, Julian. They're hosts. The root has threads in their brains. They'll see you coming before you even step on the porch." She handed him the canister of herbicide gasoline mix. It was heavy, smelling of chemical death. "This is the black gall. It's designed to rot the root from the inside out. But the heart is protected by a membrane that only Vance's DNA can bypass. It thinks you're a nutrient. It'll open for you. And what happens to you?" Julian asked. Sarah cracked the action on her shotgun. "I'm the distraction. I'm going to draw the stewards to the old tobacco barn. When the fire starts, you run for the cellar. Don't stop for anything, Julian. If you hear your father's voice, or see your mother, it's not them. It's just the clay mimicking. your memories to slow your heart rate." Before he could respond, Sarah stood up and fired both barrels into the air. The boom echoed like a cannon shot. "Hey, you want blood? Come get the leftovers," she screamed, sprinting toward the clearing of the barn. Immediately, the woods reacted. The mud cracked figures the silent stewards pivoted with mechanical precision. They didn't run. They glided through the undergrowth, their limbs clicking like dry sticks. Julian watched as Miller, the hardware store owner, bounded past his hiding spot on all fours, his spine elongated and rippling under his skin. Julian waited until the flickering yellow light of Sarah's flare drifted toward the barn. With a guttural prayer, he broke cover and sprinted back toward the Vance estate. The house had changed. In the 10 minutes he'd been gone, the kudzu had completely encased the structure. It looked like a giant, pulsing heart of greenery. The front door was no longer wood. It was a weave of thick, wet vines. Julian reached the threshold. The vines sensed him. They didn't lash out. Instead, they recoiled, peeling back like lips to reveal the dark hallway within. The house recognized his blood. It invited him in. The interior was a humid nightmare. The walls were sweating a thick, red ichor that pooled on the floor. Every step he took felt like walking on a tongue. As he reached the library, the floorboards were gone, replaced by a yawning pit that led straight back down to the hive root. He descended the stone steps again. The blue glow was blinding now. The massive, heart-shaped bulb in the center of the chamber was translucent, and inside, Julian could see the silhouette of a human form taking shape. A new Vance, being grown to replace him. "Julian, why do you fight the cycle?" The voice didn't come from the walls this time. It came from the heart itself. He looked at the wall of husks. His grandfather was gone, absorbed entirely into the fibers, leaving only a screaming face etched into the bark of the roots. "I'm not part of your cycle," Julian hissed. He unscrewed the cap of the black gall. Suddenly, a hand gripped his wrist. It wasn't a root. It was Miller. The hardware store owner had returned, his face half sloughed off to reveal a network of red fibers underneath. He looked Julian in the eye, and for a second, a flicker of the man remained, a look of absolute, soul-crushing grief. "It's beautiful, Julian," Miller whispered, his voice bubbling with fluid. "No more bills, no more cancer, no more taxes, just the red, just the peace. Let it in." Miller squeezed, his grip like an industrial vice. The canister of poison began to slip from Julian's fingers. "It's not peace," Julian roared, slamming the iron fire poker into Miller's shoulder. The metal sank deep into the pulpy mass, but Miller didn't flinch. He just smiled, his teeth falling out like white seeds into the mud. "The soil is so thirsty," Miller chanted from the corners of the cavern. The other stewards began to crawl out of the shadows. The preacher, the sheriff, neighbors Julian had known as a child. They were all there, their bodies distorted, their humanity stripped away. They formed a circle around Julian, their silver eyes reflecting the blue light of the plume. The heart began to beat faster. Thump, 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 thump. A thick needle-like spire emerged from the top of the heart, dripping with a golden nectar. It was the spore pod. In seconds, it would burst, sending the contagion into the Alabama wind, carrying the red clay hunger across the state line. Julian looked at the canister. He couldn't reach the pod with Miller holding him. He looked at the fire poker, then at the pulsing heart. He realized what he had to do. The herbicide wouldn't work if he just poured it on the floor. It had to be injected into the source. Julian stopped struggling. He let his arm go limp. Miller's grip relaxed slightly, sensing surrender. "That's it, boy," Miller gurgled. "Home. You're home." With a sudden, violent burst of movement, Julian didn't strike Miller. He turned the fire poker on himself. He drove the sharp, jagged end into his own thigh. The stewards gasped a collective, wet sound of shock. The root reacted instantly, sensing the fresh, hot blood of Vance hitting the floor. A dozen feeder tendrils lashed out and buried themselves into Julian's leg, frantically trying to suck the life out of him to fuel the bloom. Julian smiled through the blinding white pain. He grabbed the canister of black gore and poured it directly into the open wound in his own leg. The root didn't realize its mistake. It was so hungry for Van's blood that it pumped the herbicide gasoline mixture straight into its own circulatory system for 3 seconds. There was silence. Then, the heart screamed out. It was a sound that shattered the stone walls of the cavern. The blue light turned a sickly, bruised purple. The roots coiling around Julian's waist began to blacken and shrivel, turning into ash before they even hit the ground. Miller fell backward, his body dissolving into a pile of dry mold. The other stewards collapsed, their internal support systems rotting instantly as the poison raced through the hive mind. Julian watched, fading in and out of consciousness as the massive heart began to implode. It turned inside out, venting a black, foul-smelling gas that dissolved the ceiling of the cavern. The Vance estate above began to groan as its foundation vanished. Julian, a hand grabbed his collar. It was Sarah. She was covered in soot, her shotgun gone, but she was alive. She hauled him toward the coal chute just as the entire cavern began to collapse. They burst out into the night air just as the Vance house folded in on itself, sinking into a sinkhole of red, rotting mud. The woods were silent. The cicadas were dead. The heavy scent of gardenias was replaced by the sharp, acidic smell of chemicals and smoke. Julian lay on his back, looking up at the stars. For the first time in his life, the Alabama air felt thin. It felt clean. Sarah sat beside him, tying a tourniquet around his leg. "It's over," she whispered. "The main heart is dead." Julian looked at his hand. The pink smudge was gone, but as he looked out at the horizon, he saw something that made his heart stop 10 miles away, in the direction of the next county. A single pale blue light flickered in the woods, then another, and another. The root was dead, but the seeds had already been planted. Alabama is a big state, and the red clay goes deep. Julian closed his eyes. He could still hear the humming. It was faint, like a distant radio station, and it was getting louder. The harvest of great sunrise over Marengo County was a bruised, hazy violet, a color that felt fundamentally wrong, as if the atmosphere itself had been bruised by the night's trauma. Julian Vance leaned heavily on Sarah as they reached the blacktop of Highway 43. His left leg was no longer a limb he could feel. It was a heavy, dropping anchor. The denim of his jeans was shredded, soaked through with a mixture of dark blood and a translucent amber sap. Below the fabric, he could feel the black gore poison fighting a war with his own biology. The red clay hadn't just stained his skin. It was beginning to map out his veins in a glowing, subcutaneous network of orange fire. "Look," Sarah whispered, her voice a dry rasp. She pointed her shotgun toward the northern horizon through the shifting morning mist. A convoy appeared. It wasn't the flashing blue lights of the state troopers or the tan Humvees of the National Guard. These vehicles were matte black, armored SUVs and long, windowless transport trucks that moved with an eerie, electric silence. They didn't have sirens. They didn't have markings. As the lead vehicle pulled to a halt 20 yards from them, the doors opened in unison, and men in charcoal grey tactical gear stepped out. They didn't look like soldiers. They moved with the clinical, detached precision of lab technicians. They wore pressurized suits with rebreathers, but the canisters on their backs didn't glow with the green of oxygen. They pulsed with a dim, rhythmic blue light that matched the heart in the cavern. A woman stepped forward, her movements sharp and authoritative. Her tactical vest bore a single gold-embossed seal, the Department of Agricultural Equilibrium DE. She pulled back her hood to reveal a face that was strikingly symmetrical, her eyes hidden behind polarized lenses. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice amplified through a cold, metallic speaker in her mask. "We've been monitoring the seismic pulse from the Vance heart for the last 72 hours. You've performed a service for this state that you cannot possibly comprehend." Julian clutched the rusted fire poker, the only weapon he had left. "The heart is dead," he wheezed, his lungs feeling like they were filled with wet sand. "I poisoned it, the whole hive. It's rotting. I saw it happen." The woman tilted her head, a gesture that felt more predatory than curious. "Dead? No, Julian. Biological systems of this magnitude do not die, they transition. What you did with the herbicide was a catalyst. You didn't kill the root. You forced it to evacuate its primary node. You triggered a massive, state-wide relocation of biomass." She took a step closer, the red clay beneath her boots sighing as, if in recognition, the Vance heart was a bottleneck. It was a 19th century solution to a 21st century energy crisis. By poisoning the central chamber, you forced the root to distribute its consciousness across the entire subterranean network of the Black Belt. You've effectively turned a localized parasite into a decentralized, statewide nervous system. You wanted this, Sarah snarled, raising her empty shotgun. "People died. My brother is a husk in a war. The town of Demopolis is a graveyard. The town of Demopolis is a harvest," the woman corrected calmly. "Alabama has always been a land of extraction. Cotton, coal, steel. But those are finite. The root is eternal. It is the most efficient carbon capture and energy storage system on the planet. We just needed a Vance to provoke it. The root won't communicate with us. It only speaks the language of your bloodline." Julian tried to stand straight, but his leg buckled. The red veins in his skin flared bright. "I won't help you. I'll burn every inch of this dirt before I let you use me." The woman sighed, a sound of static. "Mr. Vance, you aren't listening. You aren't the gardener anymore. You are the soil." She signaled to her team. Two men moved with blinding speed. Julian tried to swing the fire poker, but his muscles felt sluggish, as if his motor functions were being intercepted by a foreign signal. They grabbed him, their gloved hands feeling like cold iron. Before Sarah could scream, a third man struck her with a kinetic baton, dropping her into the mud. "Don't kill her," Julian roared, his voice breaking into a wet cough. "She's a fascinating specimen of secondary exposure," the woman said, looking down at Sarah. "We'll keep her for the control group. But you, Julian, you're going to Huntsville. We have a clean room prepared that's deep enough to keep your singing from disturbing the neighbors." A heavy needle was driven into Julian's neck. The sedative was instant, but it didn't bring darkness. Instead, it brought a terrifying clarity. As his physical eyes closed, his inner vision opened. He could feel the road beneath the truck not as asphalt, but as a living, vibrating chord. He could feel the trees as they passed, each one a sensory pillar sending data to a central processing unit he was slowly becoming a part of. He was loaded into the back of a pressurized transport. As the heavy doors hissed shut, you saw the DE. Technicians beginning to deploy seeding canisters into the woods. They weren't cleaning up the mess, they were fertilizing it. The last thing Julian saw before the truck pulled away was the woman from the DA kneeling by the roadside. She pressed her bare palm into a patch of crimson mud. The clay didn't just stain her, it rose up to meet her, the tiny red tendrils lacing between her fingers like a lover's hand. "The harvest is ready," she whispered into the window as the convoy sped north toward the high-tech bunkers of the Tennessee Valley. The ground beneath the tires began to ripple. The highways of Alabama were no longer just paths for cars. They were the major arteries of a colossal waking organism. Every mile they drove, Julian felt his pulse slowing, synchronizing with the deep, tectonic thrum of the state inside the truck. Julian's breathing leveled out. He wasn't scared anymore. He was connected. He could hear the voices of the husks in the walls, but they weren't screaming now. They were humming, a low, resonant frequency that sounded like 1,000 gospel choirs singing underwater. He realized then the true horror of the DE's plan. They hadn't just found a new power source. They had found a way to bridge the gap between the human mind and the prehistoric hunger of the earth. And Julian Vance was the bridge. The truck hit a bump, and for a split second, Julian felt the pain in his leg. But the pain was quickly replaced by a cold, numbing satisfaction. The root was whispering to him, showing him maps of the future. He saw the city of Birmingham encased in a web of glowing red vines. The steel mills were proposed to pump nutrient-rich sap through the valley. He saw the Gulf of Mobile becoming a massive, churning stomach of biomass. The soil is so thirsty, Julian whispered in his sleep. His voice no longer sounded like his own. It was deeper, vibrating with the weight of 1,000,000 years of sediment. Outside, the Alabama landscape began to transform in the wake of the convoy. The kudzu grew at visible speeds, weaving blankets over abandoned gas stations and forgotten churches. The red clay rose in mounds, forming strange, organic towers that pulsed with a dull, bioluminescent blue light. The state was no longer a place of people. It was a place of the root. And as the sun climbed higher into the purple sky, the first spores began to drift into the wind, fine, red dust that looked like cinnamon, but carried the weight of 1,000-year hunger. The centennial bloom had ended, but the age of the red had just begun. The Department of Agricultural Equilibrium had their battery, and the root finally had its mouth. As the convoy entered the gates of the secret facility in Huntsville, a place known only as the Orchard, Julian felt the iron doors close behind him. He was home. Not the home of his father or his grandfather, but the home of the very first Vance who had knelt in the dirt and made a promise to the dark. "Welcome, Mr. Vance," a voice said over the intercom as he was wheeled into the sterile white light of the laboratory. "Let's begin the expansion." The Crimson Root, part BTH apotheosis of the deep orchard, was not a laboratory in any sense that a modern scientist would recognize. It was a subterranean cathedral of glass and chrome, buried 300 feet beneath the limestone of the Tennessee Valley. Here, the sterile white light of the Department of Agricultural Equilibrium met the primordial darkness of the red. Julian Vance lay suspended in a tank of synthetic amniotic fluid, a liquid that tasted of copper and ozone. His body was no longer entirely his own. His limbs had elongated. His skin had taken on the translucent sheen of a cave-blind salamander, and from his spine, 1,000 fine, red filaments branched out like a web, plugging directly into the facility's mainframe. He was the conductor, the biological interface between the hive root and the human grid. Through the wires and the roots, Julian could feel every inch of Alabama. He felt the heavy footfalls of a deer in the Talladega National Forest. He felt the rhythmic churning of the tides in Mobile Bay. He felt the vibration of 1,000 air conditioners humming in the suburbs of Montgomery. But more than that, he felt the hunger. System check. A voice echoed in his mind, filtered through a Neuralink. It was Agent Miller. She stood on a catwalk above his tank, looking down at him with a mixture of professional pride and religious awe. "Julian, can you hear me? We're preparing for the great integration. The Georgia nodes are ready. The Mississippi Delta is primed. We just need you to open the door." Julian didn't speak with his mouth. He spoke with a pulse of electromagnetic frequency that rippled through the facility's monitors. The soil, it is still so thirsty, his voice echoed. It was no longer the voice of a man from Chicago. It was the collective groan of the tectonic plates. We know, Miller whispered, and we're going to give it everything. We've realized that the subsidence wasn't a side effect, Julian. It was the root clearing the table. It's making room for something better, something more unified. In the corner of his mind's eye, through a camera feed, he had hijacked Julian saw Sarah. She was in a separate wing of the orchard, confined to a glass room. She wasn't being digested. She was being refined. Her body was covered in the same glowing red mapping as his. But she was still fighting. She was throwing herself against the glass, her silent screams vibrating through the root network. Sarah, Julian thought, sending a ripple of warmth through the fibers toward her. She froze. She looked at the ceiling, her eyes now the same milky silver as his. Julian, she whispered, is that you? Or is it just the clay playing tricks again? It's me. But me is a very big word now, Sarah. I can feel the whole state breathing. I can feel the power. Miller, the GE, they think they're in control. They think they've harnessed a battery. But they don't understand. You don't harness a god. You only serve it until it's finished with you. Then kill it. Sarah cried, her voice cracking. Julian, you poisoned it once. Finish the job. Burn the orchard. I can't burn what I am, Sarah, but I can change the rhythm on the catwalk. Millie checked her watch. Initiate the integration. Open the floodgates. Technicians in pressurized suits began to turn massive industrial valves. In the heart of the facility, a massive aperture opened, revealing a vertical shaft that dropped straight down into the crust of the earth. From that shaft, a geyser of pure, bioluminescent red sap erupted, channeled into the state's high voltage power lines. The integration had begun across Alabama. The lights in every home flickered from yellow to a deep, pulsing crimson. The hum of the electrical grid changed from a 60 Hz drone to a low, melodic thrum, the singing river, amplified through the wires of $1 billion infrastructure. But as the power surged, Julian didn't send it toward the cities. He turned his focus inward, toward the very base of the orchard's foundation. He felt the millions of years of limestone, the ancient fossils of sea creatures that had died before the first vans ever drew breath. He began to vibrate. He didn't use herbicide. This time, he used the one thing the root couldn't digest, the human will to be separate. He projected his memories the cold wind of Lake Michigan, the taste of a bitter coffee in a crowded diner, the feeling of a lonely walk in a city that didn't know his name into the hive mind. He flooded the collective consciousness with the beauty of isolation, the necessity of death, and the sanctity of the individual soul. The root recoiled. It was used to the Van's blood, a bloodline of pacts and duty. It wasn't prepared for the Chicago blood, the defiance of a man who would rather die alone than live as a part of a beautiful, terrifying whole. The orchard began to shake, not from a seismic shift, but from a biological seizure. The red filaments plugged into Julian's spine began to glow with a blinding, white-hot intensity. He's overloading the nodes, a technician screamed. He's sending a feedback loop. The energy is reversing. Miller's face twisted in horror. Julian, stop. You'll kill us all. You'll collapse the entire valley. Alabama has had enough of giants. Julian's voice boomed through the speakers, shattering every glass pane in the facility. It's time for the dirt to just be dirt again. He reached out through the network and found Sarah. He wrapped her in a cocoon of protective fibers, a biological shield that would weather the coming storm. Then He grabbed a black ball residue still lingering in his own blackened veins and ignited it with the sheer electrical force behind its own power. The explosion wasn't loud. It was a sound of a massive wet tearing. The orchard imploded. The glass cathedrals, the matte black SUVs, the charcoal grate ignitions, all of it was swallowed by the earth as the limestone cabins beneath Huntsville finally gave way. But it wasn't a random collapse. It was a surgical burial. As the facility fell, Julian felt the connection severing. One by one, the pixels of his statewide vision went dark. He felt the woods of Talladega return to the deer. He felt the mobile. They returned to the salt. He felt the suburban homes of Montgomery return to the people. The crimson lights in their windows flickering out and returning to a mundane, human yellow. The root withdrew, terrified by the poison of Julian's individuality. It retreated deep into the mantle of the earth, far below the reach of any drill or any DA technician. It didn't die. You cannot kill the hunger of the world, but it went back to sleep. The centennial bloom was over, and the great subsidence became a story for the history books, a mystery of geology that would be debated for a century. Epilogue. The Red Road a year later. The Black Belt is a quiet place. The government cordoned off the area around the old Vance estate, calling it a Superfund site due to high levels of unidentified chemicals. They built a fence, but the kudzu climbed it in a week, turning the barbed wire into a soft green wall. A woman stood at the edge of that fence. Her name was Sarah. She moved with a slight limp, and her eyes, though human again, still had a faint silver ring around the irises that caught the sunlight in strange ways. She lived in a small cabin 10 miles away, a place she had built herself. She didn't use the power grid. She didn't like the sound of humming wires. She walked to a specific spot near a lightning-scarred oak and knelt in the dirt. The clay here was orange-red, the color of a common sunset. "I brought you something," she whispered. She pulled a small, Chicago-style hot dog from a paper bag, a ridiculous, salty, neon-colored thing. She placed it on the ground. The dirt didn't move. There were no tendrils, no blue glows, no voices in the wind. But as she watched, a single tiny red sprout poked through the soil. It didn't reach for her. It didn't try to latch onto her ankle. It just sat there, swaying gently in the warm Alabama breeze. Sarah smiled, a tear tracking a path through the dust on her cheek. "He's still in there, isn't he?" she asked the sprout. The wind sighed through the long-lived pines, a sound that was almost but not quite a melody. Deep beneath the earth, miles below the surface, a massive shriveled heart gave a single slow beat. Thump! It wasn't a hunger anymore. It was a memory. Julian Vance was the conductor of a silent orchestra now, keeping the root in a dream of Lake Michigan winters and the quiet, beautiful loneliness of being human. Sarah stood up, brushed the red clay from her jeans, and turned toward her cabin. She knew the DE was still out there, lurking in the shadows of Huntsville, waiting for the soil to stir again. She knew that one day the hunger would return, but for now, the state was at peace. The red clay wasn't a god anymore. It was just Alabama, and Alabama, for all its scars and all its ghosts, was finally home. As she walked away, the tiny red sprout put back into the earth, leaving the surface smooth and undisturbed. The sun set behind the pines, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and honey gold. The cicadas began their nightly chorus, a sound of life that belonged to no one but themselves, and in the silence that followed, if you listened very closely, you could almost hear the sound of the wind through the pines, and the faint, distant rhythm of a heart that refused to be forgotten.